It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the unregulated Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
I'm doing great, Andy. Talk about being unregulated. One of the absolute best storytellers on that theme of liberty versus regulation is the topic of today's hero
Yeah.
show. Really
Yes.
excited.
Yeah, me too. We're of course referring to the immortal Frederic Bastiat, who
Yes.
in physical life died tragically at age 49. His dates were
Mhm.
1801 to 1850. His death generally ascribed to tuberculosis, but it was untreatable back then in the 19th century. But his writings are indeed immortal, and I have here a copy of one of his
Mm.
famous books,
Mhm.
Economic Sophisms.
Mm.
We'll discuss some of his famous essays from this book. We'll discuss it, for
Yeah.
sure. And we also have a copy of his famous booklet, The Law. And I
Yes.
want to put in a little plug here for Fee for the Foundation of Economic Education. I disagree
Yeah.
with them on this, that, or the other thing. But regarding Austrian economics and free market economics, they're brilliant, and they reissue these books as inexpensive paperbacks. So good job by them. And I think
Yes.
everybody who's concerned about the principles of rationality in economics should read Bastiat, because
Mhm.
nobody explains it more clearly, or maybe not. Perhaps Henry Hazlitt explains it as clearly as Bastiat does. Hazlitt, of course, acknowledges his debt to Bastiat, but nobody's
Yeah.
clearer or wittier and funnier in his
Mhm.
in the clarity of his expositions than Bastiat is. And we'll discuss, his ideas, for free trade and for free
Yeah.
markets today. So,
I agree, Andy. And one of the things that I enjoy so much about the Hero Show is when we come up with a subject for the week. Sometimes we plan in advance. Sometimes we just say when the episode's over, okay, who's next week? And last week we decided Bastiat. I have to admit, I read the law, but within the week, I went and got his entire his entire works. And the man, his last 6 years was so productive in his
you read
life.
that you
And
read that book
well,
in a week?
I did not read the whole book in a week. As you can see, there are no. I have a couple of
Yeah.
things on morality that I bookmarked, and but a storyteller. This is where I think he excels. And over the course of describing his biography, we'll definitely spend time on his stories. That, as you said, Hazlitt certainly gives. The broken window fallacy. Hazlitt opens up his economics in one lesson. And speaking of FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, we give them credit for bringing this man's legacy back, back to life. This is Leonard Reed, the founder of FEE.
Right.
He knew the importance of Bastiat, and we're grateful for reviving this man's legacy. And if we go back, Andy, we talk about what was France like. Remember, France had great intellectuals, Montesquieu, Lafayette, the Enlightenment thinkers that Voltaire clearly, but liberty lovers in this lineage of liberty that they had. Jean Baptiste Say, of course, the in 1800. So we mentioned Bastiat's born 1801. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was translated into French in 1800. And 1803, Say's book on the treatise on political economy, which, by the way, that was the top, it was called political economy. It was not just economics, like as a separate branch. The two were put together as one unit. And so this is where Bastiat came from. He inherited this kind of lineage of these great French thinkers uh, who had respect for liberty. I, would it be great if we had that continued kind of to this day? Nobody jumps out at me in the past century or so from that area.
Well, in the field of economics, of course, the Austrian school flourished in the 20th century. Ludwig von Mises, Frederick Hayek
Yes.
was supporters, of free markets, and Henry Hazlitt, who's I think
Yeah,
Henry Hazlitt as the 20th century Bastiat, brilliant economic
I
journalist,
agree.
not quite as witty as Bastiat.
Hmm.
Nobody
Hmm.
was, but
Hmm.
a brilliant writer. Achieving his expositions are so clear. And I have Hazlitt's book here. Great book, Economics in One Lesson. Strongly recommend this to anybody who wants to understand basic basic economics. And I think
Definitely.
along with Ayn Rand's books, I think this should be required reading in all high schools and colleges
Yeah.
in the country and around the
Hmm.
world, just for basic
Hmm.
economic principles. I'm not an economist, and I don't, in fact, what little I know about economics, I learned from Hazlitt and Bastiat. But I
Yeah.
think I do know Econ 101, which is more than most American intellectuals know today, judging
Yeah.
by their stance on policy matters. But
And
but
in my
yeah,
own copy, Andy, if I'll just say in one word what the two of them advocate, first Bastiat, and as you said, Hazlitt gives economics is the study, it's the discipline of seeing the unseen where most the general population witnesses the seen, the known. So it's short term versus long term is a way to look at this kind of conceptually. The mass public generally they see the short term consequences of some policy. Economists properly see the long term consequences and how it affects all different industries. So
and
that's
they
where
should. They should,
yes,
unless they write
integration.
for the
Yep.
yeah, right. They should, unless they write for the New York Times, of course, in which case they they won't. But
No, no.
we'll read from both
Yeah.
Bastiat and Hazlitt as the show goes along. But we should say something
Yes.
about his life.
Yeah.
His his brief life.
He was born not Bayonne, New Jersey. It's a town, Bayonne, in France, the southwest, the Basque area. It's kind of near the border of Spain. Small town. Most of his life, first half of his life, was in these small French towns that he lived. Sadly, mother died when he was like 6, 7 years old. Father died a couple of years later, and then he was raised by his grandfather and uncles, and they had business interests. And this was something that certainly Bastiat learned about and had an interest in. But if we look at France during that era, okay, 1801, he's born, okay, and it's not until 1814 that Napoleon is defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. So the first, 12, 13 years of his life, there's complete, there's war going on, and trade is like completely in the,
Robert, let me
it's
raise a
not
question here.
free
Let me
trade.
raise a
Yeah,
question
go
for a
ahead.
second. Was
Mhm.
Waterloo 1814 or was it 1815?
I'm sorry, 15.
I'm thinking,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm thinking it was June of
Well,
1815, but I'm not a
13, 14.
historian, so
Oh, wait,
I
wait,
could
wait. I
be.
think, oh boy, I'm not going to commit now. It's
Yeah,
one,
you know what?
I thought,
You know what? We'll Google it and get the data.
yeah.
And I could be misremembering, but I
Because I
think
thought the Battle
Napoleon
of
was.
New Orleans was 14, and that was right after Waterloo. The guys who defeated Napoleon lost to Andrew Jackson right after that, and I thought that was 14. But okay,
Yeah,
whatever. It
yeah.
was,
But I
it
think
was,
Napoleon was dethroned for the first time in 1814, exiled to Elba, and returned in
and they let him out.
1815 for what did they call it? The
Yeah.
100 Days. And
Yes.
I think
Yes.
Waterloo was
Hmm.
June of 1815, and then they sent him to St. Helena's, which was his Helen gone. There's no
Yeah.
way he's coming back to Europe from there. It's all the way near
Right.
the South American coast, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, I think
Yeah.
it was 1850. But I'm not a historian. You know what? Google is good on a lot of things. After the show,
Yeah.
we'll
Exactly.
check it
Yeah.
out. And all you history buffs out there, you can check our data on that as to when Waterloo occurred. But that's a minor point in this context. So you were discussing Bastiat's life.
So France is in turmoil, basically. I mean, and he's a kid growing up. And one thing he notices, Andy, is that there are tariff imports from Spain. Spain is right at the border. And the prices of simple things, wine and bread and cheese and things like that, they're so ridiculously high. and it gives rise to a smuggling, uh, black market, basically, because goods people want goods as cheaply and conveniently as possible. And if tariffs are going to make things impossible to get at a reasonable price, the smuggling profession comes out. And Bastiat noticed this as a kid, living in this border town. And so later on, his parents are gone, and it's around 1818, so he's 17 years old or so, that he starts to he's working in for his grandfather. He's doing some work, and he's realizing he's not really an astute businessman. He has an intellect, and he has a good he's good at storytelling. He loves to read, and one of the books he reads is Say's political economic treatise, and he falls in love with the idea of economics. And even though he's trying to do his duty, his grandfather eventually dies, and he's in this town Morgon, which is it's still in the backwoods, but it's closer
Mm.
to Paris. When Bastiat reaches the age of wanting to be an intellect, he wants to go to Paris because that's where the ideas are, at least in France. But he feels an obligation to his grandfather, who had helped to raise him, and he has these businesses, and he leaves the estate to uh, to Bastiat. But even though he tries to run these farms, he realizes that, no, I'm not really good at this. And
Mhm.
that's when he makes a decision to go into the field of intellect.
Right, and it's in the last. If I could skip ahead, it's in the last 6 or 7 years of his life, isn't it? That
Yeah.
he engages in prolific writing and lecturing
Yes.
in support
Yeah.
of free trade and free markets.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a couple of in-betweeners, though. So 1827, so he's like
Mhm.
26. You just subtract 1 year. Really important book he gets a hold of. Benjamin Franklin, who in France was, he was the most popular man in France. His legacy, was still highly esteemed. He gets a hold of Poor Richard's Almanac, and he loves the way Franklin can paint a picture, just make these simple analogies that the everyday person can understand. So it's not this abstract. And Bastiat says, "I'm going to adopt this style. I'm going. I love this idea, and this is a big impact, impact on his life, where he feels like, okay, not only am I going to be in the field of uh, of the intellect, but I have a model that I'm going to follow, where I'm going to tell simple stories so that everybody can understand, not just the intellectuals, not just the elite, but everybody can." So if we want to, I'll just fill in a couple more before we get to his
Yeah,
prolific writing.
go ahead.
Yeah, so he's in this town Morgon, which is where the let's Dylan, let's show a picture so people can see what the man looks like. We have several of them here today, but he's elected to. He's in his 30s, and he gets married. It's funny. He gets married, but he leaves his wife at church, and basically tries to be a bachelor for much much of the rest of his life. I think they did have a son. He's
Oh yeah,
elected a general counsel.
that sounds like a wise policy. You know,
Yeah,
shows so somebody may be a genius in one field or another doesn't mean he makes the most
yeah,
rational choices in all fields.
yes, yeah, and times were different back then. You don't know if it was if it was arranged or if there was love involved, but again, he was fulfilling the duties of, the guy had a hard life. I mean, both parents died by the time you're 10, and
Yeah.
your grandfather, raises you. So yeah, not might not necessarily have the best relationships and make the best decisions. But again, he knew the importance of ideas, and he gets elected in this town. Um, I think he's like the general, what is it, justice of peace. But now we can go to 1844, which is really right at this is the last 6 years of his life. And one of the things that has an impact on him is he's reading some French uh, um, pamphlet, because in the small town he's not reading. He doesn't have access to the daily papers, say, of Paris. Uh, he's just locally. So much of life is local, and he reads about someone writing. Some British speaker is talking about this anti-trade law that the Brits are trying to anti-corn, corn trading, free trading, and the way the French journalist writes it, he's describing the scene, and the British speaker is saying, if we adopt this law, we'll be the poorest country on earth, like the way France is. Okay. And so Bastiat reads this and he's like, is this guy really calling France the poorest country on earth? And he gets an English translation, because he studied languages, and English was one of them. And it didn't have that smear of the French in the English version. It was just some French, journalist kind of putting it in there. But the guy who wrote it, his name is Cobden, Cobden, and he.
Richard Cobden.
That's right, Richard Cobden,
English
and this is
English
the
free
first like
English free trade
yes,
free trade advocate.
exactly. And so this is where he establishes this relationship. Eventually, goes to meet Cobden in the UK, and they have a bond. Cobden's about he's older, and has more experience, but Bastiat starts writing. He starts writing these short articles, these short punchy articles. He's organizing activities. He's part of the Freemasons, which is also like an intellectual gateway, and starts to make a name, a name for himself.
Let me say something here,
Mm-hmm.
Robert, to
Yeah,
fill in some of the history for people.
yeah,
Richard Cobden and John Bright were both British free trade advocates, and they were
that's right.
famous, like you said, Robert, in the anti-corn laws. Now, corn meant grains, and the British at that time, early 19th century, had tariffs on on imported grains in order to
Mm-hmm.
protect the English landowners. But what that does is it keeps the price of grain high, bread or anything else. And a
Yeah.
lot of people were still poor. This is the early days of the Industrial Revolution, which is beginning to raise living standards from what it was under feudalism and the monarchy,
Mm-hmm.
prior to that. And so Richard Cobden, John Bright, these guys were strong advocates in Parliament to eliminate the tariffs on imported grain. And they finally succeeded sometime in the early to mid 19th century, and bread became cheaper, and the poor
Yeah.
were better able to afford bread. And Bastiat shows the reasons why for this, which we'll get to in a little bit. But also, Cobden and Bright had a strong influence on William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister. Gladstone was Prime Minister several times, and
Mm-hmm.
Gladstone, in his terms in office, was able to reduce or eliminate tariffs on any number of imported items, which of course enormously benefited English consumers. And it
Yeah.
was you know I think it was more widely understood in the 19th century but at least by these individuals we're talking about, that protectionism, putting tariffs on imported goods in order to protect domestic producers, harms domestic consumers, because now they have to pay higher prices
Yeah.
for whatever it is, bread or whatever it is, and therefore have less money to spend on other goods, which means they're poorer, and there's less money buying. There's less demand for goods of other industries, which is an unproductive policy. It means the other industries are going to will produce less because there's less demand for their merchandise. So it's harmful. Protectionism is
Yeah.
harmful for the economy. Nobody pointed that out more stringently more sedulously than Bastiat did. And one last thing: when Trump was
Yeah.
president, he did a lot of good things as president. I was very surprised by how good a number of his policies were. But I was like, right, I was reading from Bastiat and Hazlitt regarding free trade, and the
Hmm.
anti
Yeah.
protectionism. Um, but be that as it may, Bastiat is nobody's better on free trade and anti protectionism than Frederic Bastiat
Yes.
was.
Yeah, and one of his quotes, he said right around that era, right, that he was starting to gain some steam, was the solution to the problems of human relationships can be found in liberty. And he's got a zillion zingers, four quotes, and that's one of them where he sees the value. Now, one of the things that one reason he's very popular is he exposes socialism. So the socialist movement is gaining ground, and he equates it properly with slavery. But the intellectuals, the French intellectuals, sadly, even like a Victor Hugo at the time, who was only born a couple of years after Bastiat and lived a longer period of time, and obviously a prolific writer, but as a thinker, especially a thinker in terms of economics, not even completely. Um, Not even in the category of Bastiat. So he's great at exposing the evils of socialism, of protectionism, of basically the government, running your life, and he saw that in growing up, just seeing that it gives rise to smugglers and other elements of society, and that it leads to a cronyism because the ones who curry the favors, these little industries, they go to government who will give them power, and of course they want something in exchange for that power, and all of these things make the individual citizen suffer. They suffer economically, and they suffer in terms of even personal freedom. And this is where I think Bastiat was really making some ground. He was breaking some ground here in free trade. He's really an advocate. Started in France, the free trade movement. Coming out of his correspondence with Cobden, and so he's gaining. He's he's gaining prestige, moves to Paris, and so now, like, he's no longer the country bumpkin that he was, like, the first 30 something years of his life. He's a real intellect. He's worldly. He's been to Paris. He's been to London, and now he's ready to even make more of a mark, and that's where his more serious and more lasting works come out.
Just let me interject for a second. These
Yeah.
ideas and principles, this is true liberalism. This is what it means to be liberal.
Yes,
And
that's
notice
right.
the LIB root of the word liberal. It stands for liberty, for the rights of
Yeah.
the individual to run his own life by means of his own judgment and his own choices. And we could add from Ayn Rand,
Yeah.
as long as he does not initiate force or fraud. But this is true liberalism, and this liberty, free trades, free markets, capitalism, individual rights. And just as speaking of Ayn Rand, she wanted to revitalize and reclaim the term selfishness with very good reason. I think it's important for us to revitalize and reclaim the term liberal. It does not mean mixed
Yeah.
economy, semi-socialist welfare state.
No.
It means free
Hmm.
markets, free trade, and individual rights. That's what the term liberal means. So Bernie Sanders is not a liberal. You and I
No.
uh,
Yes.
are
Yeah.
liberals.
On that, right, Andy. On that note, from 1846 to 48, he was the editor of Le Libre Échange. Okay, the free trade. That's what that means. It's a free trade magazine and the Libre is free there. So, but you mentioned Ayn Rand. There are a lot of similarities, actually, that I see when reading Bastiat. How about money? It's a great quote about money. He says, "What have we been taught? That money is despicable. But money in ancient times was the fruit of either of either birth or of conquest and spoliation. And now in the industrial regime, what is wealth? It comes from the work, the savings, and foresight. And it is these qualities that must now be exalted in order to make people face up to their responsibilities. So when Ayn Rand says money is a product of intellect, that's what Bastiat is saying. Now, we lived in a much more labor intensive, he lived in a much more labor intensive era, but he's tying it into thinking and effort. And that is just fabulous. And there's no guilt associated with, whoever earns should keep their wealth. Legal plunder, we'll talk more about what he means by that, but it's just this fabulous way of showing an idea, a term, money, that we know how Ayn Rand thought of it. So many symbols and speeches that she has in her novels about it. So I like that Bastiat has that as well, as a real concretization of something of value.
Robert, is any other things you want to say about his life before we could turn to some of his essays?
Okay, yeah. So
And
just his ideas are now spreading. So we see England is embracing this liberty movement. It's going to Spain, it's going to Belgium, and even Germany and Italy. So when people are taught the idea of liberty, this is something we need today. This is why Bastiat should be read today. Like it's
mhm.
so essential that somebody like him should be read today, because he makes a clear distinction, Andy, between what people do, what they can do when they're left free, as opposed to when they are enchained by some kind of force. So, but yeah, let's move on. We'll finish. We'll cover his death after we go through his actual works. So yeah, you can take
Right.
the lead on that, whichever way you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And
Mhm.
just as background, let's go back to Jean-Baptiste Say, who was
Yeah.
a brilliant economist. Say's law, of course, is that
Yes.
demand creates supply.
Yep.
I'm sorry, supply creates demand.
The
That
primacy
backwards.
of production. Yep. Hmm.
Yes,
Hmm.
right. Supply creates demand, and the example, of course, and Bastiat said very much in the school. The simple example, of course, is if I'm an apple grower, the more apples I grow, the more productive I am. The more I have to trade with the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Speaking of candlesticks, we're going to
Yeah.
get to the candle makers petition,
Yes.
but
Great.
I have more.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. But I have more to trade. With these other producers. Demand, of course, in economics means not just desire for X, but it means desire backed by purchasing power.
Ability to
And
pay. Hmm.
yeah, right. Goods basically trade against goods, right? Money is just a convenient,
Hmm.
means to expedite trade. So, yeah, hence Say's famous point that what was it? Produce. That's the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Say said, produce. That's the whole thing, and he's absolutely right. That's how we.
Yeah.
That's how we create wealth. Wealth isn't money. Wealth is
Yeah.
food. Wealth is housing. Wealth is clothing. Wealth is medical care. Wealth is goods. Is goods and services. Say was brilliant on that. Bastiat very much in this school, and so we get to free trade. Yeah, go ahead.
Just one thing, Andy, there as well. That spurs on the entrepreneurial spirit. Okay, we hear about that today, but the entrepreneurial spirit without the ability for free trade, it will stagnate. It will be crushed. And it's one reason America, it's kind of built into the American mindset, that the entrepreneurial spirit since our inception. But I give them credit in Europe. Say, I think he coined the term entrepreneur, actually.
Yes,
Um,
yes, he did.
and
He
it's
did.
like, yeah, this is a term we use today, and that's, if we look at terms, Andy, entrepreneur is that's an esteemed term. If you tell somebody you're an entrepreneur, that's an enterpriser. They undertake challenging activities. If you tell them you're a capitalist, which there's slight difference, not really a fundamental difference there. It's like, no, that's the worst thing. If you tell them you're socialist, they'll oh, you must love people, you must love humanity, and we'll get to more of the way Bastiat debunks
Right.
that. But I
No,
just
you're
think,
right.
go ahead.
You're right,
Mhm.
Robert. Say coined the term entrepreneur and popularized. I
Yeah,
think it means undertaker in the sense
yeah,
that
that's right.
one
Yes.
who undertakes, business activities, one who undertakes
Hmm.
productive work.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, and by the way, Jean Baptiste Say deserves his own episode on the Hero
He
Show. We
does.
did one on
He
Adam.
definitely
We did
does.
one.
Yes.
Yeah, we did one on Adam Smith. So we'll
Yeah.
do one on Say in the
Yeah.
future. But since wealth is, Adam Smith was very good on free trade also. Um, but in Wealth of Nations. But since wealth is goods fundamentally, then it stands to reason that the cheaper we could buy the goods, the wealthier we will be, because then we'll have money
Hmm.
left over. If we could buy the goods more inexpensively rather than more expensively, we'll have money left over with which to purchase other goods. So we'll be wealthy. And it doesn't matter then if the wealth of nations, to use Smith's term, if the wealth of
Hmm.
nations is not judged by how much gold or silver bullion the king has, but in terms of the prosperity of its citizens, how many goods and services they have that they could buy, that they have the purchasing power for. If that's how
Hmm.
wealth of nations is determined, as it should be, then if it stands to reason that it doesn't matter from which country the goods proceed. What matters is
Yes.
that we can get the goods inexpensively. And so protectionism, of course, like in America today, let's say the steel manufacturers, American, let's say for an example, American steel manufacturers are being undersold by foreign competitors, and so American builders are buying they're building skyscrapers in Chicago or what have you. So they're buying the inexpensive steel, which is, let's say, it's sold to the American markets more cheaply than the American steel, even though the shipping costs are higher. So it stands to reason the builders are going to buy the foreign steel more than the American steel, assuming that the steel is of equal quality. So the American
Hmm.
steel makers have a powerful lobby, and they convince the U.S. Congress to slap down, or the president and Congress to slap down tariffs on imported steel. Well, that means that American builders and American producers now have, as customers, as consumers of steel, they now have to pay higher prices for steel, which means, of course, everybody has to pay higher prices. If the steel is used to build apartment buildings, let's say, then the apartments are going to rent at a higher price, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. Everybody in their role as customers or consumers of farmers are going to buy tractors, combines, harvesters, and they're now going to be more expensive
Hmm.
because the
Yeah.
steel is more expensive. You and I buying an
Yeah.
automobile is now going to be more expensive because the steel is more expensive. So protectionism is designed to protect some of the producers in the country, but nobody points out as brilliantly as Bastiat does that it hurts all the consumers, all the customers who have to buy
Yes.
that product. They now have to pay a higher price for it, and consequently they're poorer. They can't afford to buy other things. And we should read the candle makers petition, Robin. I read this
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
at least parts of it.
Before you start that, Andy, let me just tell you a concrete from my own life. I always loved milk, well, especially when I was a kid. And I remember there was a milk strike in New York, and they interviewed one of the truck drivers in the city, and he's what the strike was about was they didn't want milk coming in. There were, they had their own dairy. I can't remember now the names, but they had their own like dairy products within the five boroughs. And I just remember the guy being interviewed. He's like, "We don't want their milk coming in from Jersey." You know? And I'm saying, wait a minute, I want milk. I don't care where it comes from. I just want cheap, good, drinkable milk, not sour milk. And so even back then, like as a kid, I just saw the connection here that here's like a thug, basically saying, I don't want competition. And guess
Right.
what? If I don't have competition, I can raise the price as high as I want, and I can pay off the politicians so that nobody from Jersey can, deliver milk. and all these repercussions that come out of it. So I just wanted to add that from my childhood, I had this unit here that Bastiat is just describing so well. So you can jump into your
Right,
economic
right, and
sophistry
there's
there.
the right, and there's the main principle of economics that Bastiat points out, and that Henry Hazlitt, in the 20th century,
Yeah. Hmm.
emphasizes as well, and that is that a good economist doesn't just look at the effects of a policy on a small group and or in the short
Yes.
term, but looks at the effects of a policy on society as a whole and in the
Hmm.
long run. So the protectionism in my example may benefit the steel producers in the United States, at least in the short run, but it harms all customers who use steel, which is
Hmm.
used on on many different products. Uh, and of course, looking at it morally, the tariffs force American consumers to pay higher prices. It violates their
Yep.
rights to trade freely with foreign producers without government interceding and forcing them to pay higher prices. Now, Bastia, I mean, economic sophisms, and a sophism, of course, or sophistry is an argument that may sound it may sound effective on its surface, but when you dig in, you see it's erroneous, that it's profoundly mistaken.
It's
Now, Bastia,
sophisticated, right? It's not
yeah,
true.
yeah, right, right, right. It's spurious. It sounds good,
Yeah.
but if you dig in and really analyze it, you see
Yeah.
it's fallacious.
Hmm.
And Bastiat lampoons this protectionism. Nobody satirizes it as brilliantly, and as
Yes.
clearly as Bastiat does. So, chapter 7 in Economic Sophisms: a petition from the manufacturers of candles, tapers, blah 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 blah, the candle makers, to the honorable members of the Chamber of Deputies. Gentlemen, you are on the right track. You reject abstract theories and have little regard for abundance and low prices. You concern yourselves mainly with the fate of the producer. You wish to free him from foreign competition, that is, to reserve the domestic market for domestic industry. And further on down the page, he says, this is the candle makers, of course, we are
Yeah.
suffering from the ruinous competition of a foreign rival who apparently works under conditions so far superior to our own for the production of light that he is flooding the domestic market with it at an incredibly low price. For the moment he appears, our sales cease, all the consumers turn to him, and a branch of French industry whose ramifications are innumerable, is all at once reduced to complete stagnation. This rival, which is none other than the sun, is waging war on us so mercilessly that we suspect he is being stirred up against us by perfidious Albion, England.
Yes.
Bastia being very
Albion.
playful here.
Yep.
Yeah, by perfidious Albion, particularly because he has for that haughty island the respect that he does not show for us. Bastia making a reference to the fog, here, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, so the son has more respect for the English candle makers than he
Yes.
has for the French.
Yeah.
So he said, first, Bastiat
Amazing.
continues, if you shut off as much as possible all access to natural light and thereby create a need for artificial light, what industry in France will not ultimately be encouraged? So he's saying that the French Parliament should lawfully decree windows have to be shut up, doors have to be covered, no lights got to
Mhm.
be allowed into buildings or homes. And well, if that's the case, Bastiat, the candle makers say, well, the candle making industry is going to flourish. We're going to sell more candles because people need light during the day. Uh, and of
Mhm.
course, if France consumes more tallow, there'll be more cattle and sheep. If France consumes more oil, there'll be cultivation of poppy, olive, rapeseed, and all these industries are going to boom if we just shut the sun out of all French domiciles. So now, so Bastiat just brilliantly satirizing the protectionist argument here, and of course his own response to this argument is obviously maybe I shouldn't say obviously, in economics things aren't obvious, But certainly
Hmm.
the consumers are going to suffer. You're protecting various producers. Certainly the consumers are going to suffer. They're not going to have sunlight in their homes, which has, not only cheers, it cheers people up to have the sunlight, but it has certain beneficent qualities, vitamin D, in the
Yes.
skin and everything. But
Hmm.
economically, people are now going to be paying higher prices. They're going to be paying more and more for candles, of course, because they'll need them during
Hmm.
the day, not just at night. And consequently, they'll have
Hmm.
less disposable income to pay for clothing, for food, for transportation. They'll suffer. They'll be poorer in that regard. And of course, these other industries suffer then because of
Hmm.
the diminished demand. So Bastiat's point, of course, is protectionism always looks at the producer of X, and ignores the effects of protectionism on the consumers of it. And then that's point number one. And then, like you were saying before, Robert, to see the big picture, to see the effect
Yes.
of a policy, not just on one group and in the short run, but all the citizens of the country, and in the long run, it makes society poorer. And let me just finish here.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
Bastiat is just where is that quote from him? Here, he says, "But if the fact that a product is half free of charge, the if it comes in from a foreign country without tariffs, it's going to be the price is going to be lower, right?" So he says, "But if the fact that a product is half free of charge leads you to exclude it from competition, how can its being totally free of charge induce you to admit it into competition?"
Hmm.
Make
Hmm.
your choice, but be logical. For as long as you ban, as you do, foreign coal, iron, wheat, and textiles, in proportion as their price approaches zero, how inconsistent it would be to admit the light of the sun, whose price is zero all day long. I mean,
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
logic is just withering,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
just a brilliant argument against protectionism. And in Robert and everybody in logic, this is known as a reductio ad absurdum. He takes
Which is what he
the
would do.
protect.
Yes.
Yeah, he's brilliant at
Yep.
it. He takes the
Hmm.
protectionist argument, carries it to its logical conclusion, and shows that the logical conclusion is absurd.
Yep. Reduces it to an absurdity. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, in a way that everybody can see. This is not macroeconomics, microeconomics, and whatever that subject has kind of devolved to nowadays. That he's telling it so that the entire population can see it in turn. They know what the sun is. They know the value of the sun. And if candle makers think the sun is bad for their profession and therefore they want to ban it, it's not going to end pretty.
No,
It's just not going to end pretty. It's that simple. And Bastiat makes that case in such a forceful way. So let's go through a couple of the other ones, Andy, as a great storyteller. Let's do the broken window. The baker,
absolutely.
the baker
Yeah,
has, I like how Hazlitt calls him a hoodlum. I think Bastiat's story is not as, I think it's the son that actually breaks the window for Bastiat. But for Hazlitt, it's a hoodlum, a young hoodlum breaks a window, and
right.
the
That's right.
crowd gathers. At first they're mad, and then they're like, well, wait a minute, he's spurring the economy. Well, you could take it from there.
Yeah, and you're right, Robert. Hazlitt does call him a hoodlum, but Henry Hazlitt here again, economics in one lesson, another book that I think should be,
Mhm.
well, I already said should be widely read for basic
Yeah.
economics. Uh, Bastiat, this is chapter one in economics in one lesson. Hazlitt says, "Let us begin with the simplest illustration possible. Let us, emulating Bastiat, choose a broken pane of glass." So, he gives credit. He
Mhm.
gives Bastiat his propers here, right in that first paragraph. And so, yeah, so the crowd thinks, well, oh, what, oh, this kid's a hoodlum. He broke the glass, it's vandalism. But then some smart aleck thinks, well, wait a minute. Now, the shopkeeper's got to go to the glazier for new glass. The glass costs $250 or whatever. So the glazier has more business. So this actually stimulates production. So it's actually good for the economy. Now Hazlitt writes, again emulating Bastiat, like he said, this little act of vandalism will, in the first instance, mean more business for some glazier. The glazier will be no more unhappy to learn of the incident than an undertaker to learn of death. But but the shopkeeper will be out $250 that he was planning to spend for a new suit. Because he's had to replace a window, he will have to go without the suit or some equivalent need or luxury. Instead of having a window and $250, he now has merely a window. Or, as he was
Mhm.
planning to buy the suit that very afternoon, instead of having both a window and a suit, he must be content with the window and no more. If we think of him as part of the community has lost a new suit that might otherwise have come into being and is just that much poorer. The glazier's gain of business, in short, is merely the tailor's loss of business. And so,
Mhm.
again, the simple point, of course, that Bastiat and Hazlitt making is that, first of all, uh, the baker, it was his shop window, right? It was a bakery. The
Yes.
baker is now poorer. He would have had a
Yes.
window and a new suit. Now he has only a window. And he goes on, since the baker is part of the community is that much poorer. There's the members of the community. This one member of the community has less wealth than he otherwise would have had. And so again,
Mhm.
there's a number of important points here. And the first that we keep repeating is see the big picture, integrate, see the effects of this action on everybody.
Mhm.
Yes, it might benefit some glazier, but it harms the haberdasher who now has lost business, and it harms the baker. The society is poorer because, again, there's the broken window fallacy means, again, to
Mhm.
repeat, see the effects of a policy not just on one group or in the short run, but on all groups, and in the long run. Society is poorer. And going further, extending the analogy here, it applies to all these people that even, these economic fallacies, just they keep getting birthed over and over again. But I shouldn't be
Yes.
surprised by that, Robert. I mean, I've taught logic for many years. And Aristotle pointed out all these logical fallacies almost 2,500 years ago, and people keep committing them every day anyway. Ad hominem, or personal
Yeah.
attack, is a perfect,
Yes.
a perfect example.
Hmm.
But there are these people today, educated people today, who think that war is good for the economy. Yeah, and that's just a
The logical
fiasco.
extreme of that
Yeah,
case. Yeah, because what is war? It's destroying not one window pane, but hundreds of thousands of them when you drop bombs. And so that must stimulate the economy. I mean, it must,
yeah,
because
yeah,
someone's got to build those new houses.
exactly. Now, of
Hmm.
course, the real argument, the most fundamental argument against war is on moral grounds. You got all kinds, thousands and thousands of people,
Yes.
getting killed, like we see in Ukraine today. God knows how many Ukrainian civilians have been raped and
Hmm.
and were murdered by Russian forces. And seeing the big picture, as Bastiat and Hazlitt pointed out to us, I'm not going to blame all the Russians. I'm going to blame Putin and a lot of his advisors and
Hmm.
commanders. But that's a conscripted army. Don't forget, they got these 18-year-old kids, got Russian kids, got drafted into the army, got a few months of training, give them an automatic weapon, push them across the border into Ukraine, and tell them go kill. You know, these
Yeah.
18, 19-year-old boys, are getting killed by the Ukrainians defending their country. That's part of the seeing the big picture. Also, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So just staying on the topic of war, though, one of Bastiat's best quotes is when goods do not cross borders, then armies do. So free
Right.
republics with limited governments do not go to war with each other. It's not in their self-interest. I mean, that's again, and another point he makes is frankly, is about self-interest. He says the mainspring is of self-interest, and I'm thinking, boy, this guy just gets things right. And if we look at history, you know, so for 800 years, France and England are going at each other, right? Ever since William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
But once they start trading, and see the value of trading, long after, not maybe not even long after Napoleonic Wars. I don't even think they went to war after that.
No,
And we
that's
can
right.
thank Bastiat and say for that, because then they
Yeah,
started
right,
trading, and now there's no more wars between them. Now they're
right,
fighting other thug nations like Germany and Russia.
right. That's right. And Richard Cobden gets a lot of credit here. He's the one who
Yeah.
convinced, more than anybody, I think, convinced both the British and the French government to reduce tariffs, to end protectionism, and have a free, have a free market of goods flowing back and forth, but between them. And of course, yeah, Britain and France. You're right, absolutely right, Robert, which had been blood enemies for centuries. The Hundred Years' War is one
Yep.
example. Have been allies ever since for more than 150 years now. And the warfare between them has ended. But going back to the broken window fallacy, I mean, the
Hmm.
idea when you think about it logically, the idea that war is beneficial for the economy is absurd. At every level, even aside from the moral point that lots of people are getting killed. And let's Ayn Rand taught us that the moral is the practical. Let's look at the practical consequence of that. You got men
Hmm.
drafted into the army who are fighting and dying, who would
Yep.
otherwise be working productively, increasing
Yep.
the wealth in an economy. The war's being fought somewhere. Somebody's getting bombed. Somebody's fields are being burned. Somebody's houses are being destroyed. Somebody's
Hmm.
villages and towns and cities. You're fighting street to street and or bombing them. There's an enormous amount of destruction. So when the war is over, it looks like to some fatuous mentality. Oh, this stimulates the economy. Now we have to rebuild the cities and towns and replant the fields and everything. So this
Hmm.
stimulates productivity. And it's like that's ridiculous. If there weren't a war, would already have had fertile agricultural and productive lands. We've already
Yes.
had thriving villages and towns and cities. And the effort that we now have to put into rebuilding our villages, towns, and cities could be the productive effort could be used to produce other things, and society would be far wealthier. When you look at it from Bastiat's standpoint, the broken window fallacy, it becomes very, very, very clear that war is one a moral disaster because innocent people, including many civilians,
Hmm.
including little kids, are getting killed. But two, the
Yeah.
moral is the practical. It's a productive disaster. We're far poorer because of the war than we
Yeah.
otherwise would have been. And one last point on this: during the war, even like take World War II as an example, even in America, which by that
Hmm.
time was a highly industrialized nation, you know, the factories, American factories, weren't making as many cars or trucks or
Yes.
tractors for farmers, and so they were producing tanks and jeeps and for the war
Hmm.
effort. And so cars were more expensive during those years, and fewer people could afford cars. And food, American food production, very necessarily much of it had to go to feed the boys at the front, understandably, right, in the war against fascism. But that's not prosperity
Hmm.
when consumers have to pay higher prices for foodstuffs and there's shortages of food, domestically. It has to be to defeat fascism, but that's not prosperity. Uh, you know,
Right.
Manufacturing
Right.
weapons of war rather than consumer goods makes a society poorer, not richer. So
Yeah.
Bastiat
Yep.
understood that clearly, 150 years or more, almost 200 years ago.
Hmm.
And people today, a lot of people today still don't get it. I still hear from people that, it was good for the economy. It's not, war's not good for the economy. It's not.
No. No. Let me just give a couple of his quotes on this, Andy. He says, "Which countries contain the most peaceful, the most moral, and the happiest people? Those people are found in the countries where the law least interferes with private affairs." Okay, so now we're moving on to his probably most popular work, the law here, and where he goes
Yeah,
into
this
what is
just
legal,
a
legal
small
plunder. Uh,
booklet.
yeah. So but a couple of moral points that he makes says, now I have the actual quote: "We cannot doubt that self-interest is the mainspring of human nature." I wonder if Ayn Rand wrote that, because you remember mainspring, was that her preferred title for the Fountainhead?
Wells was it Mainstream or Wellspring? I forget. Might
Okay, yeah, I thought it was mainspring. So
it may
this
it may
source,
it,
okay,
it may have
so
been it may have been.
and self-interest. Now he follows that up by distinguishing what is popularly known as self-interest, but he's making a moral case here, and then he even goes stays on the theme of morality when he says, when plunder becomes a way of life, men create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. All right. So plunder, we see this in countries, all over the world. Sadly, America's starting to go, has been going in that direction, where plunder is the way to get to gain at least material wealth, and the morals go down as a result. But we know the primacy of morality in economics, and so when you have rational self-interest as the standard here and human life as a standard, then you have these countries that Bastiat is talking about, where there's least influence of government and private affairs. They're prosperous, they're happy, and so I just think that he makes good moral points, he makes good economic points, he makes good political points, all in a storytelling mode that I think it's simple for the everyman. He even has the everyman, right? Jack Goodfellow, I think, Jacques Bonhomme. So some of his parables have this guy, right? And he's like Joe Sixpack in effect, and just stories for that guy. Another one about the left hand. No people can't use their right hand because that's the dominant hand, and so it's like almost out of Anthem. So some of his stuff with the candle, stick makers, that's like out of Anthem, right? Those guys are boycotting the light bulb, and so yeah, just a incredible storyteller. His sadly his impact, if we go now during his life, although the free trade movement is gaining some steam, he has a chance. He's pushing forward one pro free trade legislation, and it gets squashed by who? By the lobbyists, by the protectionists. Okay, so he's seeing in real life the pragmatic businessman who is not principled, just sees right in front of him the profits that just he can make, short term benefits, not knowing that these have long term consequences, and so it just continues on in his life, and the last book that you had, Andy, the economic sophisms, he didn't finish it. He was still writing that as he was getting sicker. He's got this, his throat. He's getting weaker. He can't even read. He can't even work. So they send him to Italy, because for some reason they think there's better medical treatment there. And um,
Well,
in
the
Rome,
climate
just like last year,
climate might have been
yeah,
better. That's what they used to do for
yes,
people
that's
like
that's true. The climate, but I think there was some.
consumption. It was called consumption back then. They thought the
That's
drier climate was good for the
yeah,
lungs.
yeah, yeah. So it's interesting because last week's hero, J.P. Morgan, died in Rome, and similarly, this week's hero, Say, dies in Rome, and his last words, as he's dying, is the truth. And that's what he stood for. Like his whole life, he was about the truth. He was about exposing fallacies that people could see in everyday life.
And here's a sad truth, and we can wrap this up. Uh,
Hmm.
Bastiat's most fertile period of creativity was in the late 1840s, and it was
Yeah,
in 1848 that Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. And it's
yeah,
tragic.
yeah.
It's tragic
Yes.
that Marx and Engels have a much greater influence than Bastiat. Uh, and I mean, for one thing, Bastiat is a much better writer than Marx and Engels are, and
Hmm.
witty and much more readable and clearer.
Yeah,
But two, the more fundamental point is Bastiat is making important economic truths, whereas what Marx and Engels stand for is not just utterly mistaken in the field of economics, but is brutal and murderous in the field of morality. Relentless class
yeah.
warfare, and the need to wipe out
Hmm.
to eradicate or liquidate the owning class. So it's one of the tragedies of human history that it was Marx and Engels who became much more popular and widely influential on the intellectuals and on the humanities professors in the universities and a lot of the high school teachers.
Hmm.
If Bastiat had, or in our day, if Ayn Rand achieves that, we're going to have a much more educated citizenry and a much more moral world and a much more prosperous economy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the
On that
truth,
note, Andy, if we, I think, yeah, I think John Hersey said it in his podcast recently that Communist Manifesto, I think, is the number one read book across college campuses. It's like the number one book. Imagine if the law was, imagine if one copy of the law for every like 10 Communist Manifestos was given to the same student. What a difference something
yeah,
like this could make.
absolutely right. Let the college kids read Marx and Engels. Let them read Thomas Piketty in our day, and let them also
Yeah.
read
Right.
Bastiat and Ayn Rand, and
Hmm.
and then let
Hmm.
the most rational, conscientious thinkers amongst the student body decide whose arguments make sense, which arguments are morally superior, and which arguments are economically superior. Bastiat certainly told the truth, and I think we should
Yes.
salute him
Yes.
for that, Robert. And thank you for the economic wisdom and clarity, Mr.
Yes.
Bastiat. And I think we've done the great man credit, and we can wrap up the
Well
show today.
deserved. Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Wrap up the show today, and we could wish everybody to have a heroic day. Let's strive to lead more heroic lives, and we'll be back
Yes.
again next week with another hero to be
Another hero.
discussed on the Hero Show.